The restaurant wasn't fancy. It was the kind of waterfront spot in Eastport where the tables were packed close together and you could smell fried crab cakes from the parking lot. Miles and I had agreed to meet my family there because Lydia insisted she had the perfect place for everyone to relax before the wedding weekend. Relaxation was the last thing on my mind once I walked in. Lydia was already at the table, waving like she owned the place. She always had that hostess energy, even when no one asked for it. My mother, Janice, sat beside her, smiling as if she was watching her favorite show on TV. I could already tell I was about to be cast in the role of comic relief. Miles squeezed my hand under the table as we sat down. He knew the drill. Lydia's comments were less like casual jokes and more like targeted missiles. The waiter barely had time to pour water before Lydia leaned in. "So, Nora, what do you even call it these days? Early retirement? Permanent vacation?" She smirked like she'd cracked the joke of the century. I smiled politely. "I call it busy." She tilted her head. "Busy? You mean like gardening and errands? Must be nice not having the stress of an actual career." Janice chuckled. "Lydia, don't tease your sister." But the way she said it was the same way people say, "Stop, you're too funny," not, "You're being mean." Miles shifted in his chair. "Nora's hardly sitting around." "Oh, I know, Miles," Lydia said, waving him off. "But come on, she's 45. If she was really doing something impressive, we'd all know by now. I mean, when people ask me what my sister does, I have to shrug. It's embarrassing. Embarrassing for her. Interesting how my life seemed to cause her public shame while she bragged about every corporate deal she was attached to. The waiter asked about appetizers. Lydia ordered the most expensive seafood platter for the table without asking if anyone wanted it. Then she turned back to me. "You know, it wouldn't hurt if you got involved in one of my projects. Orion's always looking for reliable assistants. You'd probably enjoy just helping out." Assistants. Helping out. As if I'd be lucky to staple her reports. Miles's jaw tightened, and I put a hand on his arm before he said something he'd regret. "I'm good, Lydia, but thanks for the offer." Her laugh was sharp. "See, Mom? She's stubborn. No wonder she hasn't landed anywhere serious." "It's fine, though. Every family has one, right? The free spirit?" Janice smiled warmly at Lydia, then glanced at me. "Your sister just wants the best for you, Nora." That was always the line. Lydia was looking out for me. Sure, the way a cat looks out for a trapped mouse. Dinner dragged on. Lydia filled the air with updates about her latest contracts at Orion Stratagem Systems, dropping her boss's name, Gregory Shaw, every third sentence. "Gregory said this. Gregory trusts me with that." She wanted everyone at the table to know she was important, even if no one asked. At one point, she leaned back and said, "It's crazy, though. Gregory's going to the wedding. Imagine if he meets family who, let's just say, don't really fit the corporate image." She gave me that sugar-sweet smile people use right before they bite. Miles finally snapped. "You know, Lydia, you might want to worry less about image and more about treating people with respect." The table went quiet. Lydia blinked at him like he'd spoken another language. Then she laughed. "Relax, Miles. I'm just teasing. Nora knows I love her." Love. Right. Her version of love came wrapped in sarcasm with a bow of humiliation. Janice broke the silence. "We should focus on the wedding. Lydia's done so much planning. She picked a beautiful venue in Annapolis. Everything will be perfect." Lydia smiled like a pageant queen. "It will be, Mom. I've taken care of every detail. The guest list, the seating, the catering." Gregory was so impressed when he heard I was managing it all. He said not everyone has that kind of organizational skill. I sipped my water. Organization wasn't the word I would have used. Control fit better. The main courses arrived. Lydia's salmon was plated like art. I had a simple grilled chicken sandwich. Predictably, she noticed. "Really, Nora? At a nice dinner and you order that? Sometimes I swear you don't even try." "I was hungry for a sandwich," I said, taking a bite. She shook her head. "No wonder people don't take you seriously. Presentation matters." Miles muttered. "Or maybe substance does." But Lydia was too busy lecturing Janice about corporate networking to hear. The bill came, and before anyone could reach for it, Lydia snatched it up. "Don't worry, I've got this. I know things are tight for some people." She glanced in my direction. That was the final dig of the evening. She paid with her company card like she was sponsoring charity. Walking out to the parking lot, Miles whispered, "You should have said something." I shook my head. "What's the point? She hears what she wants to hear." He frowned. "Still, she doesn't get to talk to you like that." "That. She does if I let her," I said. But here's the thing, I wasn't letting her. I was choosing my battles. Lydia thought she'd written my story, middle-aged sister, unemployed, living off scraps. She had no clue she was starring in a completely different story, one she wouldn't enjoy. The night air smelled of salt and diesel from the marina. Miles held the car door open for me, still bristling from dinner. "You're too calm," he said. "Calm doesn't mean weak," I told him. "It means I know exactly what I'm doing." And I did. Because the real story of my life wasn't written at a seafood restaurant in Eastport, and it definitely wasn't written by Lydia. I pressed the fork gently into my salad, letting the clinking sound drown out Lydia's sharp laughter from across the table. She was telling one of her favorite stories, the one about how I supposedly gave up on a career because I couldn't handle real work. Her friends laughed along not because the story was funny, but because Lydia was relentless when she wanted an audience. I kept my eyes down, chewing slowly, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Miles nudged my leg under the table, the small gesture grounding me. He knew better than anyone that I had no intention of defending myself in that setting. Let Lydia have her performance. She needed it more than I did. The truth was too big, too serious, and too private to waste on a petty dinner. The next morning, I walked into my office at Fort Meade, swiping my badge through the heavy doors that always reminded me of steel vaults. The quiet hum of secure servers replaced Lydia's laughter like a salve. Here, I wasn't the unemployed sister. I was Lieutenant Colonel Nora Bennett, program manager for a defense modernization project with the Department of Defense. I hung my coat over the chair, smoothing the sleeve out of habit. My assistant, Staff Sergeant Cole, was already at his desk with 2 cups of coffee. He grinned when he saw me. "Ma'am, you've got a briefing with Shaw at 0900. He specifically asked for your update on the Aberdeen test results." "Thanks, Cole," I said, taking the coffee and setting my files on the desk. The stack was thick, full of field reports, test data, and procurement schedules. None of it looked like the kind of paperwork someone between jobs would be dealing with. But Lydia had no idea this world even existed. To her, a career was measured by LinkedIn job titles and glossy photos at corporate cocktail hours. My uniform, my service, the classified projects, they were invisible to her. And honestly, that was the way I preferred it. At 9 sharp, I walked into the secure conference room. Gregory Shaw, Senior VP of Orion Stratagem Systems, was already at the head of the table, flipping through his notes. He looked up as I entered, his expression breaking into a professional but warm smile. "Lieutenant Colonel Bennett," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Always a pleasure." "Likewise, Mr. Shaw," I replied, setting my folder down. The briefing ran smoothly. I presented the test results, explained the operational adjustments, and laid out our projected deployment schedule. Shaw asked pointed questions, but nothing I wasn't prepared for. After years of managing both military staff and civilian contractors, I knew how to balance precision with patience. When the meeting wrapped up, Shaw lingered for a moment. "You know, Bennett, it's always impressive how you run these programs. Half the room could be drowning in acronyms and you make it all sound simple. That's a skill." "Clarity saves time," I said with a small smile. As I gathered my materials, Shaw added, almost as an afterthought, "By the way, I'll be in Annapolis next month for a wedding. Lydia Bennett's, I believe. Any relation?" My hand froze for just a second before I slid the last paper into my folder. "Yes, she's my sister." "Well, that's a small world," he said, adjusting his watch. "She's on the business development team at Orion. Works hard, I'll give her that. Not always subtle, but driven." He gave me a knowing look before heading out of the room. The irony wasn't lost on me. Lydia, who spent her evenings mocking my so-called lack of ambition, was walking around every day under the corporate umbrella of a man who had just listened to me brief him on classified defense projects. Later that night, Miles and I sat on the couch, dinner plates balanced on our laps. He was flipping channels, but his eyes drifted to me every few seconds. Finally, he set the remote down. "You gonna tell her?" I shook my head. No, not now. Let her keep thinking I'm unemployed. It doesn't change anything. It might change how she talks to you. I laughed, a short, dry sound. Miles, she wouldn't change. She doesn't want the truth. She wants someone to look down on. He studied me for a moment. And you're okay with that? I'm okay with her underestimating me. It's useful. The truth was, Lydia's ignorance gave me a kind of cover. I could live my life, manage my team, lead soldiers, and oversee multi-million-dollar programs without the constant noise of her competition. She thought I had nothing to show. Fine. That made my quiet victories even sweeter. 2 weeks later, I was back in uniform at Aberdeen Proving Ground, standing on the observation deck while engineers tested the updated targeting system. The air smelled like jet fuel and damp earth. Soldiers moved with precise choreography, their voices clipped and confident. I leaned on the railing, watching the system lock onto the target and fire. The impact shook the ground beneath my boots. One of the younger officers glanced at me, his face breaking into a grin. "Ma'am, that's a clean hit. Exactly as predicted." "Well done," I said, jotting a note in my pad. Behind me, a civilian contractor muttered, "Impressive work. If this scales, it changes the game." "1." I nodded, already thinking about the briefing slides I'd need for the Pentagon. Out here, the stakes were real. Lives depended on getting it right. That night, back at home, I washed the Aberdeen dust from my hair and changed into a simple sweater before heading to my mother's house for Sunday dinner. Lydia was already there, glass of wine in hand, holding court as usual. She spotted me as I walked in and smirked. "Well, look who finally showed up. Busy with your hobbies?" I kissed Mom on the cheek and set down the pie I'd brought. "Something like that." Lydia rolled her eyes. "You know, Nora, you should really think about doing something serious. You're not getting any younger, and it's kind of embarrassing when people ask what you do. I don't even know what to tell them." Miles, sitting at the table already, clenched his jaw, but stayed quiet. I poured myself a glass of water, met Lydia's gaze, and said evenly, "Tell them I keep busy." She smirked again, satisfied she'd scored another point. But across the table, Miles gave me that look, the one that said, "One day, she's going to regret this." I shifted in my chair as Mom passed the mashed potatoes down the table, her eyes flicking to me with the same silent judgment Lydia wore like perfume. It was always subtle at first, Mom praising Lydia's new condo, her tailored suits, her boss at Orion. Then it would slide into comparison, like grease under a door you couldn't stop from seeping in. "You know, Lydia," Mom said sweetly, "I still think it's so impressive how you manage such big accounts at your age. Not everyone can do that." Lydia smiled modestly, like she hadn't been fishing for the compliment all night. "Well, someone has to bring in the contracts, right? Not everyone can afford to sit around, enjoying free time." Her eyes darted to me, just for a second, like a knife slipped between ribs. I spooned potatoes onto my plate, keeping my face neutral. Miles reached for the rolls and deliberately brushed his hand against mine, grounding me again. He knew the drill. Mom folded her napkin on her lap, clearly warming up. "Nora, I just wish you'd take a little initiative. Lydia's right. You're smart, but what are you doing with it? You can't expect to just drift forever." "Drift?" Miles muttered, his voice low enough only I could hear. I squeezed his knee under the table before he could escalate. "I'm fine, Mom. Really." "Fine isn't a plan," she replied, her voice tightening. "You're nearly 45. You should think about your future. Stability, respectability. These things matter." I cut my chicken carefully, my knife steady even though my pulse wasn't. If only she knew that stability for me meant command rosters, readiness reports, and decisions that affected lives in real time. But she didn't know, and I wasn't about to lay my classified life on the dinner table like a parlor trick. Miles finally looked up, his patience thinning. "Janice, with all due respect, Nora's doing more than fine. She doesn't need to explain herself every Sunday like it's a job interview." The table went quiet for a beat. Lydia's smirk deepened, enjoying the tension like it was a show she'd scripted. "Relax, Miles," she said smoothly. "We're just having a conversation. Families talk about things. Unless Nora has something she doesn't want to share." I set my fork down, keeping my tone even. "There are things I don't share, and that's not up for debate." Mom huffed, clearly annoyed at the wall I'd just raised. But Lydia leaned back, swirling her wine, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of someone who thought she'd just cornered me. After dinner, I stayed behind to help Mom clean the kitchen. She handed me a stack of plates, her voice softening just enough to sting. "I know you think I play favorites, Nora, but Lydia has worked so hard. You could learn from her." I stacked the plates in the sink, rinsing them under the hot water. "I don't want what Lydia has, Mom." Her hands paused on the counter. "Don't you want more?" I almost laughed. More. If she only knew how many millions of dollars of contracts I managed, how many colonels and generals trusted me to get the job done. But to Mom, more meant promotions she could brag about at her church luncheons. "I'm happy where I am," I said simply. She sighed, clearly unconvinced. "Well, I just worry. I don't want people to think." "Let them think what they want." I cut in, sharper than I meant. Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing more. On the drive home, Miles rested his hand on the wheel, his jaw tight. "You know, if they keep pushing, I might just tell them myself." I shook my head. "No, the more they underestimate me, the better. It's not about them." "Maybe not for you," he said, glancing at me. "But it kills me to sit there while Lydia runs her mouth. You deserve better than that." I stared out the window at the darkened streets. What I deserve and what I need are two different things. I need cover. I need to focus. They give me that by not knowing. He drummed his fingers on the wheel. "So you're just going to let her keep taking shots at you?" I smiled faintly. "Let her. She thinks she's playing chess. I'm in a different game entirely." A week later, I was back at Fort Meade, standing in front of a room full of uniformed officers and civilian analysts. The projector cast charts onto the wall: deployment readiness, budget allocations, projected timelines. I spoke with authority, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice. Every eye was on me, every question aimed at my judgment. When the briefing ended, a colonel pulled me aside. "Bennett, you've got a gift. You balance the technical and the human side better than most. Don't lose that." I thanked him, but inside, I felt the same cold twist I always did after praise. Because while these men and women saw me for who I was, my own family never would. That Friday, Lydia called. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity won. "You busy?" she asked, her tone casual but carrying that edge of superiority. "Depends," I said, leaning back in my office chair. "Well, I just wanted to remind you about the engagement party next week. Don't forget. And maybe..." She paused, pretending to think. "Maybe wear something nice? You know, presentable. Derek's boss will be there, and I don't want him thinking my family is, well..." My grip on the phone tightened. "Well, what, Lydia?" "You know. Modest. It's important to make a good impression. For me." I bit back the laugh bubbling in my throat. If only she knew who her boss really respected. "Don't worry," I said evenly. "I'll be there." "Good," she said, satisfied. "Just don't embarrass me." After I hung up, I stared at the phone for a long moment. Miles walked in, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He set one on my desk, reading my face instantly. "She at it again?" "She thinks I'll embarrass her in front of Shaw," I said. He smirked. "That's rich." "Yeah," I murmured, sipping the coffee. Let her keep thinking that. The truth was, Lydia was digging her own hole. She just didn't know how deep it went yet. I adjusted the microphone on the podium, the soft static crackling before the sound technician gave me a thumbs up. The auditorium at Aberdeen was filled with defense contractors, military officers, and government staff, all waiting for the latest updates on modernization programs. Rows of suits and uniforms faced me, notebooks open, phones silenced. I cleared my throat and began. "Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Nora Bennett, Program Manager for Next Gen Systems. Today, I'll walk you through our latest results, lessons learned, and operational timelines." Uneject. The slides behind me lit up with schematics and data points. I spoke with practiced calm, fielding questions from the audience with precision. When one contractor pressed me on cost overruns, I cut him off politely but firmly. "We don't cut corners, we manage risk. There's a difference." The room went quiet before moving to the next topic. Halfway through, I noticed Gregory Shaw slip into the back row. He wasn't in uniform, suits were his armor, but his presence was enough to shift the room's weight. He listened closely, chin resting on his hand, eyes narrowed in concentration. When the briefing wrapped up and polite applause filled the space, Shaw made his way down the aisle. "Lieutenant Colonel Bennett," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Excellent presentation. You made complex material look straightforward. Not many can do that." "Thank you, sir," I replied. He tilted his head. "I didn't realize you were that Bennett. Lydia works on my team. She never mentioned her sister was leading programs at this level." I smiled politely. "She and I don't usually talk shop." Shaw studied me for a beat, clearly connecting dots Lydia had never bothered to draw. "Interesting," he said finally, then excused himself to speak with another group. Back in the hallway, I exhaled, leaning against the cool cinder block wall. Shaw's recognition was inevitable, but it added a new layer of tension. If Lydia had painted me as her unemployed older sister, Shaw was now sitting on information that could turn her entire narrative upside down. Later that afternoon, I walked through the exhibit hall where contractors displayed flashy prototypes. Drones hovered in cages, VR headsets lined booths, and eager reps shoved brochures at anyone with a badge. I kept my pace even, scanning, evaluating, noting which pitches had substance and which were smoke. At one booth, a young salesman launched into his spiel, but when he glanced at my badge and saw my rank, his tone shifted, instantly less glib, more careful. I let him talk, nodding occasionally. Perception mattered. People revealed themselves in how quickly they adjusted when they realized who they were dealing with. By the time I returned to my office, my inbox had exploded. Meeting requests, follow-ups, press inquiries. I sat down heavily, sipping lukewarm coffee. Cole peeked in. "Ma'am, you crushed it today." Words spreading fast. "Thanks, Cole," I said, setting the mug down. "But keep the flattery short. We've got a lot of work to do." That night, Miles grilled steaks on the back porch. I sat beside him, the smell of charcoal drifting in the cool air. He cut into his food and said casually, "So, Shaw knows now." I raised an eyebrow. "News travels fast. Arlie. He's Lydia's boss. If he saw you at Aberdeen, there's no way he doesn't connect the dots." I chewed slowly, thinking. The question is whether he'll say anything to her. Miles leaned back, grinning. "Do you want him to?" I shook my head. "Not yet. Timing matters." He pointed his fork at me. "You're playing a longer game than she even realizes." "Always," I said simply. The following week, Lydia called again, this time bubbling with excitement. "Nora, you have to come to the wedding planning session. We're finalizing the guest list. Derek's boss and Gregory Shaw are definitely coming. This is a big deal for me, so don't screw it up, okay?" I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "Don't worry, Lydia. I'll manage." "You always say that," she snapped. "But this time it matters. Just try not to embarrass me." I hung up without answering, staring at the phone until Miles slid it from my hand. "She's digging herself deeper," he said. I nodded. "And Shaw already has the shovel." That Friday, I found myself back at Fort Meade, reviewing procurement schedules with my team. We spent hours cross-checking figures, ensuring suppliers were aligned and costs were contained. It was tedious but essential work, the kind that built careers quietly, not loudly. During a break, Cole leaned over. "Ma'am, do your family even know what you do? I mean, the level you operate at?" I smiled faintly. "Not really." "Why not?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "Because sometimes," I said, closing the binder, "the less people know, the more clearly they show you who they are." When I drove home that evening, traffic heavy on Route 32, my mind replayed Shaw's expression at Aberdeen, the recognition, the curiosity. He knew the truth. The question was how and when it would surface. As I pulled into my driveway, the porch light flicked on. Miles was already at the door, holding 2 glasses of wine. He handed one to me as I stepped inside. "To surviving family dinners and industry days," he said dryly. I clinked his glass. "To staying quiet until it matters." The wine slid smooth down my throat, but my thoughts were sharp, focused. Lydia had no idea the world she tiptoed around every day was the one I commanded. And one way or another, she was going to find out. The florist's shop smelled like lilies and roses, too sweet and cloying for my taste. Lydia stood at the counter, flipping through a binder of centerpiece designs as if she were planning a state dinner. Her fiancé, Derek, hovered behind her, phone in hand, half listening while scrolling through emails. I trailed a few steps back, holding my tongue while she haggled with the clerk over the price of imported orchids. She turned suddenly, her eyes sweeping over me with that same familiar disdain. "Nora, do you mind standing a little straighter when we're out in public? You look, I don't know, tired. This is my wedding, and people will notice." I raised an eyebrow. "People notice flowers, not posture." She gave a quick laugh, the kind that wasn't really laughter. "Well, when you don't have a career to impress anyone with, appearances matter even more." Miles, who had come along only to keep me from grinding my teeth to dust, cut in smoothly. "She looks fine, Lydia. Maybe focus on the orchids." Derek glanced up from his phone, clearly uninterested in defending me. "Lid's right, though. Weddings are about image. First impressions last." I met his gaze, steady and unblinking, until he looked away. "First impressions can also be deceiving," I said evenly. Back at Mom's house that evening, Lydia unpacked her shopping bags, spreading fabric swatches across the dining table like a general planning troop movements. Mom hovered beside her, offering suggestions and nods of approval, treating Lydia like a prodigy orchestrating the event of the century. "Nora, you'll sit at the third family table," Lydia announced, not looking up from her list. "Third?" Miles asked before I could speak. "Yes," Lydia replied casually. "It makes sense. Derek's colleagues and Mr. Shaw need to be closer to the head table. We don't want anyone confused about priorities." I smoothed the tablecloth beneath my hand. I wasn't aware weddings had seating charts based on corporate hierarchies. Lydia sighed, exasperated. "It's about networking. Derek's boss has to see us as polished, organized. I can't risk anyone looking out of place." Mom jumped in quickly. "Nora, don't make this harder for your sister. It's her big day. Just go along with it." I leaned back, crossing my arms, letting the silence hang long enough to make Lydia shift uncomfortably. Then I smiled faintly. "Don't worry. I'll be exactly where I need to be." The next day, while Lydia toured the reception hall, I was back in uniform at Fort Meade, briefing my team on final logistics before the Aberdeen deployment test. The contrast between worlds couldn't have been starker, one obsessed with flower arrangements, the other with readiness reports and precision strike data. "Ma'am," Cole said as the meeting wrapped up, "you'll be at the test site during the rehearsal dinner. Should I let Shaw know you'll brief him after?" I shook my head. "No, Shaw doesn't need updates then. Let him enjoy his evening. Timing is everything." Driving home, I thought about Lydia's smug smile when she relegated me to the third table. She thought she was diminishing me, but all she was really doing was building a stage. And the more comfortable she felt at the top, the harder the fall would be when gravity did its work. That weekend, Miles and I went shopping for his suit. While he tried on jackets, I picked through ties, running my fingers along the silk. He stepped out of the dressing room, tugging at his sleeves. "You're sure you want to keep quiet through this whole thing?" he asked, eyeing himself in the mirror. "Yes," I said. "Let Lydia script her show. The best reveals happen when no one expects them." He grinned at his reflection. "You sound like you're planning an ambush." I shrugged. "Maybe I am." Back at home, I set my own suit aside for pressing. It wasn't flashy, but it was tailored, dignified, and carried more weight than Lydia's entire seating chart combined. The lapel pins sat in a velvet box on my dresser, gleaming in the lamplight. I traced one with my fingertip, imagining Lydia's expression when someone finally noticed. Sunday dinner came again, and with it, another round of Lydia's carefully aimed barbs. She bragged about Derek's promotion prospects, about the incredible exposure this wedding would bring, and about how family impressions mattered more than ever. "Nora," she said brightly, "just try not to wear anything too plain. We don't want Shaw thinking my sister can't keep up." Miles nearly choked on his water. "Trust me, Shaw already knows exactly who Nora Island." Lydia tilted her head, suspicious. "What's that supposed to mean?" I cut in before he could answer. "It means I don't need to prove anything to Shaw. Or anyone." She frowned, clearly dissatisfied with the lack of drama. Mom, as usual, jumped in to smooth things over. "Let's not argue. We should be supporting Lydia." I stood collecting plates. "I am supporting her. I'll be there. That's all that's required." As I rinsed dishes in the kitchen, Lydia's voice drifted in from the dining room. "Honestly, sometimes I think she enjoys being difficult. like she wants to test me. Miles leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, his voice low enough only I could hear. She has no idea. I dried my hands, gave him a small smile, and said, "That's the point." The sharp crack of boots against the training field echoed like a drumline. I walked along the row of reservists standing at attention, their uniforms crisp, their eyes steady. The sun burned high overhead, but no one shifted. Discipline was second nature here. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett, one of the younger officers, called out as I approached. "We've integrated the new protocols. Ready for your review." I nodded, stepping onto the gravel path that cut between the squads. My gaze scanned every detail, the gear, the posture, the readiness. These weren't hobbies, as Lydia liked to mock. This was work that carried weight. When you gave an order here, it wasn't to impress a boss at a cocktail reception. It was to ensure someone came home alive. I clasped my hands behind my back. "Show me." The drill unfolded with mechanical precision. Commands barked, movements executed, adjustments corrected. My presence wasn't about micromanaging, it was about reinforcing that what they were doing mattered. And it did. As they finished, I gave a single nod. "Good. Small details save lives. Don't ever forget that." "Yes, ma'am," they chorused, voices carrying across the field. Afterward, I walked back toward the admin building, gravel crunching beneath my boots. Cole caught up with me, files tucked under his arm. "Ma'am, I know you said to keep your family out of your business, but I overheard something at Aberdeen last week. Word about you reached Shaw's executive circle. He knows more than you think." I kept my expression neutral. And he seemed impressed. Like, really impressed. "I don't think he'll keep quiet forever." End quote. I stopped at the building steps, the weight of Cole's words settling over me. Then, we'll see how Lydia handles the truth when it comes from someone other than me. That night at home, I stood in front of the bedroom mirror, still in uniform. Miles leaned against the doorway, watching me quietly. "You look like a different person in that," he said softly. I smoothed the jacket, the insignia gleaming under the lamp. "I'm the same person. It's just a part Lydia refuses to see." "Oh wait," he stepped forward, placing his hands on my shoulders. "Maybe she doesn't want to see it, because then she'd have to admit she's been wrong all this time." I gave him a small smile. Admitting she's wrong isn't in her vocabulary. Sunday rolled around again, and once more we gathered at Mom's dining table. Lydia was already there, animatedly retelling some story about a client dinner. Derek chimed in occasionally, his voice full of self-importance, bragging about late nights and game-changing proposals. When I set the casserole down, Lydia barely paused before aiming another barb. "Nora, you've been awfully quiet. Busy with knitting circles again?" I poured myself water, unbothered. "Not exactly." Mom frowned, sensing tension. "Girls, not tonight." But Lydia wasn't done. "You know, sometimes I wonder if you enjoy people assuming you're, underemployed. Most of us try to avoid embarrassment." Miles's fork clattered against his plate. "Lydia, enough." She waved him off. "I'm just saying, image matters. Not all of us can afford to live like it doesn't." I sipped my water slowly, letting her words hang in the air before answering. "Image doesn't save lives, Lydia. Substance does." The table went still. Lydia blinked, caught off guard by the firmness in my tone, but she recovered quickly with a scoff. "Spare me the fortune, cookie wisdom." 1. I set the glass down with deliberate calm. "It's not wisdom, it's experience." Mom looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. Derek cleared his throat, trying to shift the conversation back to safe ground. Anyway, we finalized the seating chart. Shaw will be at the main table, of course. "Lydia, you'll love how it turned out." Lydia perked up instantly, her smirk returning. "Perfect. It's all coming together." I leaned back, folding my arms. She thought she was orchestrating perfection. She had no idea the stage she was building wasn't hers to control. The next morning, I was back at Fort Meade, reviewing after-action reports from the weekend drill. The words on the page faded for a moment as I remembered Lydia's smug face across the table. My pen tapped against the desk in steady rhythm. Cole stepped in, dropping another folder. "Ma'am, you've been requested to attend the Pentagon Roundtable on Tuesday. They want your direct input." End quote. I signed the report in front of me and handed it back. Book it. When he left, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The contrast was so sharp it was almost absurd. In one world, I was treated like dead weight. In the other, I was asked to advise the Department of Defense, and the line between the two worlds was growing thinner by the day. Later that evening, Miles grilled burgers in the backyard while I tended the small garden. I kept more out of habit than need. He glanced over as I pulled weeds, dirt smudging my hand. "You know," he said, "sometimes I think you enjoy letting her underestimate you." I straightened, wiping my hands on my jeans. Enjoy isn't the right word, but it's useful. People reveal themselves when they think they're dealing with someone weaker. And what's Lydia revealed? I met his eyes. That she cares more about appearances than people. And that's going to cost her. He nodded slowly, flipping a burger with practiced ease. Guess the only question is when? I didn't answer. Timing wasn't a question. Timing was everything. As twilight fell, the faint buzz of my phone pulled me inside. A message from Cole flashed on the screen. "Shaw confirmed for Annapolis wedding attendance. Seemed amused when your name came up." I slid the phone into my pocket, the corner of my mouth curving upward. The pieces were aligning on their own. Outside, Miles called in. "Burgers are ready." End quote. I joined him on the porch, the scent of grilled meat mixing with the cool evening air. I sat down, took a bite, and let the quiet stretch between us. Lydia thought she was scripting the perfect show. She didn't know the spotlight was already shifting. The rehearsal dinner was set in the side hall of a historic Annapolis inn. All polished wood and chandeliers hung a little too low for comfort. Lydia swept in ahead of everyone, draped in a cocktail dress that looked designed for maximum attention. Derek followed, shaking hands with his colleagues and dropping corporate jargon into every other sentence, as if he were hosting a quarterly review instead of a family gathering. I arrived with Miles a few minutes later, in a dark suit that blended in but didn't apologize. The buzz of chatter quieted just enough when we entered. Lydia's eyes darted toward me, scanning for flaws. She smiled, sharp and insincere. "Well, at least you dressed up," she said. Miles smiled politely, but his grip on my hand tightened. "Evening, Lydia." Before I could respond, Gregory Shaw entered, his presence commanding the room without raising his voice. His tailored suit fit like armor, his expression calm but alert. Derek lit up immediately, guiding Shaw toward the group of Orion colleagues. "Mr. Shaw, glad you could make it. This is going to be a night to remember." Zetting. Shaw offered a firm handshake, polite but reserved. His eyes flicked over the room, settling briefly on me. I caught the subtle pause, the recognition, before he turned back to Derek. Introductions rolled on, with Lydia orchestrating the flow like a director. She leaned in close to Shaw at one point, lowering her voice just enough for those near her to hear. "You'll have to forgive my sister if she seems out of place. She doesn't exactly move in corporate circles." Shaw's gaze cut toward me again, just for a second, before he offered a neutral smile. "I'm sure she holds her own." I raised my glass slightly in acknowledgement, keeping my expression unreadable. Lydia's smirk faltered, but she quickly recovered, pivoting back to Derek's colleagues. Dinner moved slowly, each course paired with Lydia's endless chatter about wedding logistics. She bragged about imported linens, about the photographer's artistic vision, about the sheer importance of making the right impression. Every few minutes, she dropped another jab in my direction, always with that same sugary tone. "Nora, maybe don't sit too close to Shaw during the ceremony. I'd hate for him to think our family is, well, modest to a fault." Miles nearly set his fork down hard enough to break porcelain. I touched his arm lightly under the table, calming him. Shaw, however, didn't let it slide. "You know," he said, cutting into his steak with slow precision, "I find that the people you least expect to impress often end up being the ones who matter most." Lydia blinked, caught off guard, then laughed nervously. Of course. I just like everything to be perfect." "Perfection's overrated," Shaw said mildly, but his eyes lingered on me. After dessert, I stepped outside for air. The night was cool, the harbor lights casting long reflections across the water. Miles joined me a moment later, slipping his jacket over my shoulders. "She's relentless," he muttered. "She's predictable," I corrected. "And predictable people are easy to manage." Before he could reply, Shaw stepped out, his hands in his pockets. He looked between us, then at me. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett. Miles raised his eyebrows but stayed quiet. You recognize me, I said simply. Shaw gave a short nod. From Aberdeen. And from more than one project before that. His voice lowered. I have to say it's interesting. Lydia never mentioned her sister was the same Bennett briefing the Pentagon. I shrugged. It doesn't come up. Shaw studied me for a long moment. Your choice, I assume? Yes. He nodded slowly, then glanced back toward the glow of the dining room. You're letting her set a stage she doesn't realize she's not controlling. I allowed a faint smile. Observation suits you, Mr. Shaw. He gave a quiet laugh, then excused himself, heading back inside. When we returned, Lydia was already holding court again, this time lecturing Derek's colleagues about how family presentation reflects professional credibility. She gestured toward me with her wine glass, her tone light but biting. Take Nora, for example. She's comfortable. Too comfortable. Sometimes I wish she'd aim higher. I met her eyes across the table, steady and unblinking. Careful with judgments, Lydia. Tomorrow might bring surprises. She laughed, but it was thin, shaky at the edges. Oh, don't be dramatic. Derek, eager to smooth over any tension, jumped in. Nora, you know we only mean well. It's about character. How people carry themselves says everything. And I've never misjudged anyone's potential. The words hung in the air like a challenge. I set my glass down, leaning in slightly. Confidence is admirable, Derek. Just make sure it's not arrogance disguised as certainty. A ripple of silence spread across the table. Derek flushed, opening his mouth to respond, but Shaw's low chuckle cut through the tension. Well said. Conversation resumed, but the energy had shifted. Lydia was less sure of herself now, her laughter coming too quickly, her voice pitched too high. Derek, for all his bravado, glanced at Shaw more often than usual, like he was suddenly afraid of being measured. When the evening finally ended, guests drifted out in pairs and groups, murmuring polite goodbyes. Lydia hugged Shaw a little too tightly, thanking him for his support. He gave her a stiff smile and moved on. As Miles and I walked toward our car, Lydia called after me. Nora, don't try to make tonight about you. This is my wedding, and I won't let you ruin it. I turned, meeting her glare head on. I didn't have to make it about me, Lydia. You did that yourself. Now. Her face froze, her mouth opening to retort, but no words came. I left her standing there, wine glass trembling in her hand, the lights of the inn gleaming against the tension she'd built with her own arrogance. The suit hung on the closet door, pressed to perfection, its charcoal gray fabric catching just enough light to look sharp without being flashy. On the dresser, the small velvet box sat open, the military service pin glinting like a quiet secret. I stood there for a long moment, arms crossed, measuring the weight of what tomorrow would bring. Miles came up behind me, slipping his arms around my waist. You're thinking too much, he said softly. I'm preparing, I corrected. He rested his chin on my shoulder. You don't need to. The truth is already on your side. I reached up and touched the pin. Truth doesn't matter until people see it for themselves. He kissed my cheek. So you're really going through with it? No warnings, no speeches tonight, just let it all play out? Yes, I said firmly. Let them underestimate me one last time. We ate dinner quietly, neither of us saying much, the air heavy with the anticipation of a storm we both knew was coming. After the dishes were cleared, I sat at my desk, checking over a stack of notes not for the wedding, but for the next Pentagon review I had scheduled the following week. Work had always kept me steady, even when family chaos threatened to unbalance everything. As I slid the papers back into their folder, my phone buzzed. A text from Lydia. Don't forget, the ceremony starts at 2. Please, Nora, try not to make things awkward. This day is about me. I stared at the message, shaking my head. Miles leaned over, reading it too. His jaw tightened. She doesn't even realize what she's setting herself up for. That's the point, I said quietly, deleting the text. Later that night, I walked into the spare room, where boxes of old files and photos lined the shelves. I pulled down one of the album's black and white snapshots from my early years in uniform. Training, deployments, ceremonies. There were faces in those pictures that weren't around anymore, and I felt their weight as I flipped through each page. These were the people who had taught me what honor meant, Lydia had no concept of it, and tomorrow she'd be confronted by the difference. Miles appeared in the doorway. Memory lane? Perspective, I said, closing the album. Remind me why you never told them? Not even your mom? I leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. Because they never asked. They assumed. And assumptions reveal character more than answers ever could. He nodded, though the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. I just hope she doesn't say something tomorrow she can't take back. I gave him a tired smile. Oh, she will, that's guaranteed. But whether she learns from it, that's the real test. We went to bed late, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. I lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling, running through tomorrow's sequence in my head. Not a mission exactly, but close enough. Timing mattered, posture mattered, and silence could speak louder than any speech. At some point, sleep finally found me. When I woke, the morning sun was cutting sharp lines across the bedroom floor. Miles was already up, making coffee, the smell drifting through the hall. You ready? He asked when I walked in, hair still damp from the shower. More than ready, I said, pouring myself a cup. We ate breakfast in silence, the kind of silence shared between two people who didn't need words. Afterward, I dressed slowly, pulling on the suit, buttoning each cuff with deliberate care. When I pinned the service insignia to my lapel, I paused, fingers pressing against the cool metal. Miles watched from the doorway. That's all it takes, he said softly. I turned, meeting his eyes. That's all it ever took. The drive to Annapolis was steady, traffic light for once. The city gleamed under clear skies, the harbor alive with sailboats cutting across the water. As we pulled up to the venue, guests were already milling about in suits and dresses, champagne glasses flashing in the afternoon sunday. Lydia was outside, clipboard in hand, barking orders at the catering staff like a general before battle. When she spotted me, her eyes flicked over my suit, her lips tightening just slightly. Well, at least you made an effort, she said. I smiled faintly. Wouldn't miss it. Derek appeared at her side, already sweating under the weight of his tux. He gave me a once-over, then forced a smile. Glad you could make it. This day is big for us. Let's not complicate it, all right? I adjusted my lapel pin, letting the insignia catch the light. Of course, I said evenly. They both turned away quickly, eager to get back to their performance. Miles touched my arm lightly. Stage is set. Inside, the air buzzed with chatter, glasses clinking, laughter too loud to be real. Shaw hadn't arrived yet, but when he did, I knew he'd notice. He always noticed. I took my seat in the front row, hands folded in my lap, eyes calm. Around me, guests whispered about flowers, suits, the cost of the venue. None of them had any idea that the real cost, the one Lydia was about to pay, wouldn't come in dollars. Miles leaned close, his voice low enough only I could hear. You're sure you're ready for this? I kept my eyes forward, my voice steady. I've been ready for years. End of tree. The chapel smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers, sunlight streaming in through stained glass windows that painted the pews in soft colors. Guests filed in, their conversations buzzing with the kind of polite energy that always came before a ceremony. I stood quietly near the back, watching Lydia float through the crowd in her silk gown, cheeks glowing from nerves and attention. Derek stood near the altar, talking too loudly to his colleagues, his chest puffed as if he'd just landed a promotion instead of a marriage. He spotted Shaw entering and straightened his tie with quick, nervous hands. Shaw, in his usual calm stride, shook a few hands, accepted a drink, and scanned the room with that sharp gaze that missed nothing. When his eyes met mine, recognition flickered immediately. He gave the smallest nod before turning his attention back to Derek, who was already trying too hard to impress him. The ceremony began with the traditional music. I walked my mother to her seat, her hand clutching my arm, her expression a mixture of pride for Lydia and impatience with me. I didn't take it personally anymore. I had learned long ago that some people only valued what they could measure in titles and outward success. When it came time for the procession, I moved into place beside Nancy, Lydia's maid of honor, who fussed over the dress train like her life depended on it. Lydia looked radiant, but her eyes kept darting toward Shaw's row. Even at her wedding, she wasn't thinking about vows or family. She was thinking about her boss. The officiant began, his voice steady, guiding the couple through the vows. Lydia and Derek delivered them with practiced smiles, their words polished and smooth. The guests dabbed at their eyes, cameras clicked, and Shaw sat watching with the same calm he always carried, though every now and then his gaze shifted back toward me. When the final "I do" was spoken, and the kiss sealed it, the room erupted in applause. Lydia's smile stretched wide, triumphant, as if she had just won something more than a husband. The receiving line formed in the foyer, Derek proudly introducing Lydia to his colleagues. "My wife," he repeated over and over, as if the word itself made him more important. Lydia soaked it in, her hand clinging to his arm, her laughter floating above the crowd. When Shaw approached, Derek's face lit up. "Mr. Shaw, thank you for coming. It means the world to us." Shaw shook his hand, polite but restrained. Then his eyes flicked to me again, just long enough to unsettle Derek, who rushed into his next introduction. "And this is my new sister-in-law, Nora. She's between jobs right now, but she tries to stay busy." The words dropped heavy, practiced, and cutting. Lydia nodded along, her smile thin. "Yes, Nora's still figuring things out. We try to keep her involved, though." Shaw's gaze didn't move from me. For a moment, the entire room felt suspended, as though every conversation had gone quiet to hear what he might say. His expression shifted calm recognition, tightening into something sharper. "Nora Bennett," he said, his voice carrying just enough for others to hear. "Lieutenant Colonel Bennett. We met at Aberdeen last month, didn't we?" Lydia's glass froze halfway to her lips. Derek blinked, caught mid-smirk, his face draining of color. Shaw stepped closer, extending his hand to me with respect. "Your briefing was one of the clearest I've seen in years. You've been running programs that make a real impact." I shook his hand firmly, my expression steady. "Good to see you again, Mr. Shaw." The silence in the room was palpable. Derek stammered, his voice thin. You're in the Army?" "Reserve," I corrected. "But yes, I manage defense projects." Lydia's eyes darted between me and Shaw, her face paling as she registered the implications. Shaw wasn't finished. He turned back to Derek, his tone sharp now. "You introduced your sister-in-law, one of the key program managers on national defense contracts, as between jobs? Do you even realize who you're talking about?" The nearby guests froze, their champagne glasses hovering midair. Derek opened his mouth, but no words came out. Lydia tried to laugh it off. "Oh well, Nora never talks about her work. We didn't want to exaggerate." Shaw cut her off with a raised hand. "Exaggerate? I've been working with her for years. She's one of the reasons projects get delivered on time. Without her, half the systems you brag about in sales meetings wouldn't exist." Miles stepped closer to me, his expression calm but proud. The rest of the room buzzed with whispers, guests realizing that the woman Lydia had mocked for years had just been recognized as someone who carried actual authority. Derek swallowed hard, his confident facade collapsing. He mumbled something about not knowing, about just trying to lighten the mood, but the damage was done. Shaw's voice cut through again. "Not knowing isn't an excuse for disrespect, especially not toward family." The crowd shifted, their gazes turning toward Lydia now. Her cheeks burned crimson, her practiced smile gone. She tried to recover with another weak laugh, but it sounded brittle, almost pitiful. I stood silently, letting the weight of the moment settle. No gloating, no grand speeches. Just presence. That was enough. Shaw clapped me lightly on the shoulder. "Good to see you, Lieutenant Colonel." Then he turned, leaving Derek to stew in his humiliation. The guests began murmuring again. The energy of the room shifted. Some looked at me with new respect, others at Lydia with barely disguised pity. Derek tried to pull himself together, shaking hands too quickly, his voice cracking as he tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. But the crack had already split wide open. Miles leaned close, his voice low. Well, that was satisfying. I gave a small smile. That was necessary. We moved into the reception hall, chandeliers glittering overhead, tables set with meticulous precision. Lydia clung to Derek's arm, her eyes darting nervously toward me every few seconds, as though waiting for the next blow. Derek avoided Shaw altogether, his earlier bravado replaced by silent panic. I found my seat at the family table, Miles beside me. The music swelled, waiters served plates, and laughter bubbled around the room. But beneath it all was the unmistakable hum of tension. the kind that lingers after truth has ripped through a carefully built facade. The clinking of forks and glasses filled the reception hall, but the easy rhythm of celebration had fractured. Conversations leaned toward whispers, eyes flicking between Lydia, Derek, and me. Lydia's carefully built image was cracking, and she felt it. Her smile looked painted on, the corners trembling each time Shaw's name was mentioned nearby. I kept my posture relaxed, letting the buzz wash over me. Shaw sat only a few tables away, surrounded by Orion colleagues who now eyed me with open curiosity. He raised his glass once in my direction, subtle but unmistakable. Lydia noticed, her jaw tightening so sharply I thought she might snap the stem of her own glass. When the toasts began, Derek stood, fumbling with his note cards. His voice quivered as he tried to regain control of the evening. I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate our special day. And of course, a special thank you to Mr. Shaw, whose presence honors us. He glanced toward Shaw, but the executive was busy swirling his wine, uninterested in empty flattery. Derek's voice faltered, and Lydia swooped in, grabbing the microphone with her polished smile. I'd like to thank my husband for his kind words, she said, her tone dripping with control. And I'd also like to thank our families, especially my mother, for teaching me the value of hard work and ambition. Without those lessons, I wouldn't be standing here today. She paused deliberately, her eyes flicking toward me like a blade finding its mark. And to my sister Nora, well, thank you for being here. Even when life doesn't quite go as planned, family shows up. And that's what matters. Then, a ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Some guests shifted in their seats, others looked down at their plates. Lydia smiled wider, mistaking silence for success. Before she could pass the mic, Shaw's voice cut across the room. Excuse me. The microphone squealed as he rose, commanding the room without effort. Lydia froze, caught mid-motion, her smile faltering. Shaw adjusted his cufflinks, then spoke with the calm authority of a man who'd led more rooms than Derek could dream of. I feel compelled to add something, he said, scanning the tables. Because while it's true family shows up, it's also true that sometimes we don't realize the depth of what they bring with them. He turned his gaze directly on me. Lieutenant Colonel Bennett has been one of the most competent program managers I've ever worked with. The systems she's overseen are the backbone of projects this country depends on. She doesn't just show up. She leads. The silence that followed was electric. Lydia's knuckles whitened around the microphone. Derek swallowed audibly, his Adam's apple bobbing like a buoy in rough water. Shaw continued, his tone pointed but measured. It's ironic, isn't it? To dismiss someone as between jobs, while they're the reason contracts like mine exist. Respect is earned by results, not appearances. And I've seen Lieutenant Colonel Bennett deliver results time and again. A wave of murmurs spread through the room. Lydia's face flushed crimson, her practiced poise crumbling under the weight of the revelation. Derek's hand twitched at his side, helpless to salvage the scene. I didn't move, didn't speak. I didn't need to. Shaw had said everything for me. Miles leaned close, his voice barely above a whisper. She's finished. The microphone slipped slightly in Lydia's grip. She laughed, too high, too strained. Well, isn't that something? I guess my sister's been keeping secrets from us. Shaw raised an eyebrow. It's not a secret if you never bothered to ask. That line landed harder than any slap. The guests shifted, many now looking at Lydia not with admiration but with judgment. She handed the mic back to the DJ, muttering something about moving on. Her control over the room completely shattered. Dinner resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. Guests approached me quietly, offering polite compliments, some embarrassed they had believed Lydia's narrative. A few Orion staffers introduced themselves with genuine respect, eager to connect now that they understood who I really was. At the head table, Lydia sat stiff, her fork untouched, her smile gone. Derek whispered frantically to her, but his words fell flat. The image she had built so carefully was collapsing in real time, and nothing she said could stop it. Later, as the music picked up and guests took to the dance floor, Shaw approached me again. Lieutenant Colonel, he said, his voice low but firm, you carry yourself with more patience than most people deserve. But I'll tell you this, your restraint tonight said more than any speech could. I nodded. Restraint is sometimes the sharpest weapon. He chuckled. I'll remember that. Miles shook Shaw's hand, and together we watched Lydia from across the room. She clung to Derek, her eyes darting nervously, her laughter brittle and unconvincing. The room no longer revolved around her. The spotlight had shifted, and she knew it. As the evening wound down, Mom finally approached me, her face pale, her eyes uncertain. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked softly. I looked at her, steady and calm. "Because you never asked, and because what I do isn't about dinner table approval." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, shame flickering across her features. For the first time in years, she had no defense for Lydia. Miles placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the exit as the last song played. The chandeliers above glittered, but for Lydia, the night was nothing but shadows. I stepped into the cool night air, the murmur of voices still spilling from the hall behind us. Miles exhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take after a long fight finally ends. "You didn't have to say a word," he said. "No," I agreed. "The truth did it for me." Amen. The following morning, the wedding hangover wasn't measured in champagne headaches, but in silence. Lydia's phone lit up nonstop, her face tight as she scrolled through message after message. Word traveled fast, faster than she ever imagined. What she had carefully curated as her moment of triumph was now being dissected in whispers and side conversations. I sat quietly at the breakfast table with Miles, sipping coffee, watching Lydia pace in the next room while Derek tried to salvage her mood. His voice carried just enough through the thin walls of Mom's house. "Lyd, it wasn't that bad," he insisted. "Not that bad?" she hissed back. "Shaw humiliated me in front of everyone. Do you know how that looks? Do you know what people are saying about me at work right now?" Derek had no answer. He mumbled something about damage control, but the truth hung between them. Damage had already been done. Mom shuffled into the kitchen, her face drawn, her tone sharper than usual. "Nora, you should have told us." I set my mug down carefully. "And what would that have changed, Mom? You wouldn't have believed me. Lydia would have twisted it, and I would have still been the same person whether you knew or not." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to argue, but for once, she didn't have ground to stand on. By noon, Lydia had retreated to her bedroom, phone glued to her hand, panic dripping from every word she muttered into it. I caught fragments: HR, misunderstanding, professional image, miscommunication. She was scrambling, trying to get ahead of the story. Meanwhile, Shaw had already moved on. At his level, calling out hypocrisy was less about drama and more about reinforcing standards. For him, the night had been a test of character, and Lydia had failed it in spectacular fashion. Later that afternoon, Derek stormed into the living room, loosening his tie, his face flushed. "She's being ridiculous," he snapped, "running around like the world ended because someone complimented you." Miles looked up from the newspaper. "It wasn't just a compliment, Derek. It was the truth finally catching up." Derek glared at me, his voice rising. "You couldn't just let her have her night, could you?" I stayed calm, my tone steady. I didn't say a word. Lydia did this to herself. He clenched his jaw, but he couldn't argue with that. After a long pause, he muttered something under his breath and disappeared into the kitchen. The cracks in their perfect image were widening by the hour. 2 days later, Lydia's fears materialized. Orion's HR department reached out, scheduling a clarification meeting regarding her behavior at the wedding. Someone had reported the incident, whether it was Shaw directly or another guest didn't matter. What mattered was that the company now had reason to examine her conduct, her judgment, and her professionalism. When she stormed into Mom's kitchen to complain, her words tumbled out like a flood. "They think I was disparaging you. They're twisting everything. I could lose my job because of this." I leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Maybe you should have thought about that before calling your sister a loser in front of your boss." Her eyes blazed. "You set me up." I shook my head slowly. "No, Lydia. You set yourself up. I just stood there." Miles poured himself another cup of coffee, his tone laced with dry humor. "Gravity works the same way every time. You climbed too high on a shaky ladder. Don't blame the ground for being there when you fell." Mom tried to intervene, her voice pleading. "Girls, please. We're family. We can work this out." But Lydia wasn't listening. She grabbed her purse, her movements sharp, and stormed out the door, slamming it behind her. The weeks that followed unraveled quickly for her. At Orion, whispers spread faster than she could counter. She was pulled into HR meetings, asked to explain context, required to attend ethics training. Her projects were reassigned temporarily, though everyone knew what that meant. Derek, who had built his ego around their image as a power couple, started snapping at her in public, embarrassed by the loss of status. For me, life went on as usual. I filed reports, led briefings, oversaw testing schedules, but beneath the surface, there was a quiet shift. Colleagues who had been indifferent now treated me with a little more deference, having heard about the public recognition from Shaw. Soldiers under my command seemed to stand a little straighter, knowing their leader's authority wasn't just internal but acknowledged beyond the uniform. At home, Miles and I found peace in the simplicity of our routine dinners on the porch, quiet mornings with coffee, long walks on weekends. He never gloated, but every now and then, he'd shoot me a look across the table, the kind that said, "Justice has a way of serving itself." One evening, Mom called me. Her voice was softer than I'd heard in years. "Nora, I didn't realize how much I overlooked. You've done so much, and I never gave you credit. I'm sorry." I let the silence stretch for a moment, absorbing her words. "I didn't need your credit, Mom. I just needed you not to dismiss me." Her sigh was heavy but genuine. "I see that now." As we hung up, I felt something shift, not a complete repair, but a step toward balance. Lydia, however, was still drowning. Rumors swirled that she was on a performance improvement plan. Derek stopped bringing her to corporate events. Even Mom couldn't defend her sharp tongue anymore. The same arrogance that once made her look polished now made her look reckless. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had tried to humiliate me by calling me unemployed, only to nearly derail her own career through her own arrogance. Meanwhile, I kept moving forward, not by shouting my achievements, but by living them. And every time I looked at Miles, calm and steady at my side, I knew I'd chosen the right way to fight, not with spectacle, but with patience. Because in the end, Lydia's downfall wasn't orchestrated by me. It was written by her own hand, signed and sealed the moment she decided appearances mattered more than respect. When Lydia's official suspension email arrived, the sound of her phone hitting the table was louder than the notification itself. She had fought it every step of the way. Meetings, denials, excuses. But Orion's HR department made their decision clear. 2 weeks suspended without pay, mandatory ethics training, and a performance improvement plan waiting when she returned. She stormed into Mom's living room, where I happened to be visiting, waving the printed letter like it was a court summons. "Do you see this? Do you see what they're doing to me?" I glanced at it calmly. "That's not something they do unless they have a reason, Lydia." Her voice cracked under the weight of panic. "They're destroying my career." Miles, sitting beside me, didn't look up from his magazine. "No, you're destroying your career. They're just writing it down." Lydia spun on him, ready to lash out, but stopped. Even she knew that in this moment she had no defense. Mom wrung her hands nervously. "Maybe this is a wake-up call, sweetheart. Maybe you need to step back. Think about how you treat people." Lydia rolled her eyes, but for once, the usual venom was missing. She looked tired, drained. Her arrogance had cracked. Over the next few weeks, she tried to keep her social circle intact, but friends avoided the subject, and colleagues stopped returning her calls. Without her job to prop up her image, Lydia suddenly had nothing to brag about. The silence was louder than any gossip. Meanwhile, I carried on with my routine briefings, project oversight, unit inspections. My life didn't revolve around Lydia's downfall, though she tried to make it seem like it did. Whenever she called or cornered me, she accused me of enjoying her humiliation. I didn't need to answer. The truth was obvious. I hadn't engineered any of this. One afternoon, she showed up at my doorstep. No makeup, no polished business look, just sweatpants and a messy bun. She stood there awkwardly, clutching a folder. "I need help," she said flatly. I raised an eyebrow. "With what?" She shoved the folder at me. Inside were drafts of apology letters for her company. They were stiff, formal, drenched in insincerity. They want me to acknowledge what happened. But if I admit too much, I'm done. If I admit too little, I look arrogant. I can't get the balance right. I looked at her for a long moment. This was the first time she'd asked me for help in years without disguising it as advice she didn't need. "Start with the truth," I said finally. Not the half-truth. Not the polished version. Own what you said and why it was wrong. Her face twisted. That makes me sound weak. No, I corrected her. That makes you sound human. She didn't like the answer, but she listened. Over the next hour, I sat at the table with her, reshaping the language, stripping out the self-pity, forcing her to confront the arrogance in her words. By the end, she had a letter that didn't scream damage control. It read like someone taking responsibility. She hated it, but she sent it. Weeks later, when she returned to work, she was quieter, less showy. People still gave her side glances, but at least she had stopped pretending nothing had happened. The ethics training became her new talking point, except now, instead of boasting, she used it as a shield proof that she had learned. But in private, I could see the cracks. The wedding humiliation had carved deep into her pride. Then one evening, she showed up again. This time, her tone wasn't defensive. I can't undo what I said about you, she admitted. I can't erase how I acted, but I don't want to be the sister everyone avoids. I leaned back, studying her carefully. Then stop being that sister. She looked away, embarrassed. HR suggested I get involved in something meaningful. Community service, outreach, whatever. They want proof I actually changed, not just words. I don't know where to start. It was almost ironic the same company she once bragged about, now treating her like a rookie who needed character training. Miles, who had been listening from the couch, spoke up. Why don't you organize something for veterans? It'd fit your company's defense contracts and it might actually do some good. Lydia hesitated, then turned to me. Would you help me with that? I considered it. On one hand, she was asking for my expertise not out of respect, but because she had no other option. On the other hand, if she followed through, maybe she'd learn something. I'll help, I said slowly, but only if you're serious. If this is just another photo op, I'm out. Then, her nod was small, but real. I'm serious. For the first time in years, I believed her. Over the next month, she began organizing a veterans job fair with Orion's sponsorship. I watched her struggle coordinating vendors, recruiting companies, learning the difference between empty gestures and actual support. She made mistakes, but she corrected them. She stopped cutting corners. And for once, she listened when I explained how military transitions really worked. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. When the event finally happened, dozens of veterans showed up, some landing interviews on the spot. Lydia stood at the registration table, handing out packets, her usual air of superiority replaced by something quieter. Respect, maybe. Later, as we packed up, she turned to me. You know, I thought this would just be for show. But it mattered. I saw it on their faces. I met her eyes. That's because you finally stopped talking about success and actually did something useful. She gave me a weak smile. Guess I had to learn it the hard way. Miles walked up, carrying a box of leftover brochures. Some lessons only stick when they're expensive, he said. Lydia didn't argue. She just nodded, accepting it. For the first time in years, my sister wasn't looking at me as competition, or as someone to tear down. She was looking at me as someone she needed to learn from. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The weeks after the job fair felt strangely calm, like the dust had finally settled after a long storm. Lydia didn't suddenly transform into a saint, but something in her shifted. She stopped bragging at family dinners. She listened more. She asked questions instead of making snide remarks. And for once, when she mentioned work, it wasn't to flaunt a new client or deal. She talked about the veterans she had met, the stories she'd heard, and how different her perspective had become. Mom noticed it too. At one Sunday dinner, she quietly pulled me aside in the kitchen. I don't know what you did, she whispered, but I've never seen your sister like this. She's softer. I smiled faintly. I didn't do anything, Mom. Life did. Miles chuckled from across the room, and maybe a little dose of public humiliation helped. Mom gave him a sharp look, but even she couldn't deny he was right. Meanwhile, my own life kept its steady rhythm. The Army Reserve role didn't slow down projects, deadlines, briefings, but I didn't need to flash medals or titles to anyone anymore. Least of all my family. The people who mattered knew who I was, what I'd done, and what I was still capable of doing. The rest was just noise. At home, Miles and I lived simply, And I liked it that way. We weren't chasing status symbols or trying to impress anyone. Our evenings were filled with porch dinners, laughter over burnt toast on lazy mornings, and long walks where the heaviest decision we made was whether to take the long trail or the short one. One afternoon, Lydia called me out of the blue. Her voice was hesitant, not her usual sharp tone. "Nora, I've been thinking. I want to keep this Veterans Fair going. Maybe make it an annual thing. Would you help me again?" I paused, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. "If you're serious, yes. But this can't be about saving your career anymore. It has to be about the people it's meant to serve." She exhaled slowly, almost like she'd been holding her breath. "I know, and I am serious. I want to do it right." For once, I believed her without hesitation. Months later, when Orion's board commended her for the community initiative, Lydia didn't boast. Instead, she publicly credited me. "My sister showed me what it really means to serve," she said during her speech. The room applauded, and I sat quietly in the back, neither basking in the spotlight nor rejecting it. I was just glad she finally understood. That was the moment I knew things had truly changed. Not because she said the words, but because she finally acted like someone who had learned a lesson. At home afterward, Miles raised his glass at dinner. "Well, Lieutenant Colonel Bennett, looks like you managed to fix more than just Army programs." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't stop the smile tugging at my lips. "I didn't fix her. She fixed herself. I just refused to play along with the act anymore." He nodded. "Sometimes the hardest thing to do is nothing. Let people hang themselves with their own rope. You just stood back and let her." And he was right. That was the truth. Over time, Lydia rebuilt some of her reputation at work. She didn't rise as fast as she once dreamed, but she earned a level of respect she had never achieved before. Not through arrogance, but through effort. She stopped trying to be the loudest voice in the room and started focusing on being the most reliable one. For Mom, the change brought peace. She no longer had to referee endless fights or excuse Lydia's behavior. For the first time in decades, family dinners weren't war zones, they were just dinners. Normal. As for me, I didn't need revenge anymore. What I got was far better. Respect, balance, and the simple joy of living a life that didn't need defending or explaining. The real lesson was this: titles fade, jobs come and go, but honor and respect stick. People can call you a loser or dismiss you as unimportant, but none of that changes the truth of what you've built, who you've served, and how you've lived. I didn't need to tell Lydia who I was. Life told her for me, and in the end, I think she finally understood. Miles leaned across the table one evening, his voice steady but teasing. "So, do I need to worry about your sister calling you a loser again?" I smirked. "Not if she likes keeping her job." We both laughed, the kind of laugh that came from relief more than humor. Because deep down, I knew the war with Lydia was over. Not because I won, but because she finally stopped fighting battles that didn't matter. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest victory of all. Looking back, I realized the entire ordeal was never about proving myself to Lydia, to my mother, or even to Shaw. It was about refusing to let anyone else define my worth. Lydia called me a jobless loser because that's what she needed to believe in order to feel powerful. But power built on arrogance collapses fast, and she learned that the hard way. I never needed revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't sabotage her. I didn't scheme against her. I simply stood in my own truth and let her words reveal more about her than they ever did about me. In the military, we learn that honor isn't loud. It doesn't brag. It doesn't beg for recognition. It shows itself in how you carry yourself when nobody's watching, and in how you treat people whether or not they can do something for you. Lydia's humiliation wasn't my victory, it was her turning point. And if she truly carries forward what she's learned, then maybe we both win. Because respect, once lost, can be rebuilt. And family, even when scarred, can find a way back to balance. For me, I'll keep living the same way I always have. Quietly, steadily, without needing to prove anything. Because at the end of the day, titles fade, applause dies down, but honor stays. And that's something no insult can take away.